All right, Isaiah chapter 14. Let's call this one the world, except understanding that in the last chapter we saw the way in which the judgment against Babylon was actually going to be against the entire world as well, or at least the wicked in it. This time he's going to talk about the ways in which Babylon's destruction is going to bring a measure of relief to the world, except two nations. Our familiar friend, Assyria, and this time also Philistia, because the last two sections of the chapter, even if they are smaller sections, are devoted to the way in which they have their own judgment ahead for the wrongs that they have done. Understanding, however, taking it in order, the chapter begins with a call to relief or joy for the remnant of Judah or Israel, understanding the way in which they will be reassembled and permitted to take captive those who had been their captors. As after those first couple of verses, verse 3 is going to talk about the ways in which not only has the remnant been given rest, they will be permitted to take up a taunt against Babylon in at least two or maybe even three forms. One against the kingdom of Babylon. After that, against the king of Babylon. And then finally, against his legacy, so that no wickedness can rise from him or from Babylon again. It's going to describe the way in which God is going to make a complete end of them. Taking the things that most caught my attention in order this time, because it is probably, or there are probably more of them than the usual one or two or three. Beginning in that first section regarding Israel's remnant taunting Babylon, going roughly from verses 3 through about 11, talking about the taunt taken up against the nation. One of the things that caught my attention, in addition to the fact that the whole earth, even its trees, get relief from them in verses 7 and 8, is the way in which Sheol opens up, presumably to allow all of those who were slain by Babylon to welcome Babylon with a taunt as well, or at least the king of Babylon with a taunt as well. Going on in that second section devoted to the taunt against the king of Babylon, a recurring verse or phrase that comes up starting in verse 13 is his presumption represented by all of his plans in his I will statements. I will ascend to heaven. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of the assembly. I will ascend above the heights. I will make myself like the Most High, he says, reminiscent of the presumption that we saw God deal with in the king of Assyria, helping us to understand that even though we may not all end up being kings, there is a certain level of inflated self-assurance or flat out ego that we can suffer, and I say suffer, to the degree we have blessings from God that can go to our head. And for that reason, we can not only find relief in the taunt against Babylon, but if we're wise, quite possibly a lesson in the way that pride can take us all, understanding that they were originally sent against God's own people to humble them for the pride that infected them. The tragedy of this story being something reminiscent of the lessons or the days of judgment that God sent against Israel and its kings at times. The fact that the level of pride that infected the king of Babylon also infected his legacy, understanding, as we said in that third section, going from roughly 21, or really just in verse 21, that third section describing the fall of Babylon or the taunt against it, talks about the way in which God is going to make a complete end of, like we said once again, the king of Babylon's legacy. Understanding the way in which his legacy might have been infected with his ways. As we noticed, the destruction of Babylon brought a level of relief to the entire world, except Assyria and Philistia, and not for just any random reason or any random wrongdoing. One of the subtle themes that seem to be running through their judgment is the fact that, much like Babylon, they seem to have gone way too far in the role they played in God's judgment against Israel too. Verse 25 specifically saying, I will break the Assyrian in my land, and on my mountains trample him underfoot. And his yoke shall depart from them, and his burden from their shoulder. Verse 32, the last verse in the chapter, quite possibly being included in that condemnation of Philistia when it says, what will one answer the messengers of the nation? The Lord has founded Zion, and in her the afflicted of his people find refuge. Reminding me of the beginning of the chapter in verse 2, where those lucky enough to survive the judgment are eventually held captive by the remnant of Israel that they once took captive. Reminding me once again of the very simple summary that Jesus gave us of God's eternal judgment, stating that with the measure we use, it will be measured back to us, something that provides a source of comfort now for Christ's remnant.